Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for attending today. This is our Part 3 series of Did You Know ICE Could Do That? Today we're going to be talking about forms specifically, so let's just get started. Once again, let me introduce myself. I am Elizabeth Wojcik, and I'm the Director of Client Strategy and Development for CSI. I had the pleasure to work with several of you as your account manager. So the majority of this call today is mainly for people that own the ICE product and had it for several years, but also there may be some on the call that are thinking about ICE as a potential product. The reason we do these webinars is that we've come to realize that those groups that have been on ICE for a long time and use it every day may not necessarily realize all the capabilities that it has as we add enhancements to it often. So this series is just to kind of help you learn some things about your ICE system that you can modify, enhance, and just identify creative ways to use the product so you can get the most out of your dollars in investment. This will be recorded so you can go back and review it again later, or maybe share it with other staff members, especially if you have other staff members working on forms. As I do each time, I want to point out that we have made considerable updates to the ICE user manual, and it's easily accessible from your ICE admin site. We've made it a priority to keep this user manual up to date so that it can be helpful to you. So I want to challenge all of you to review this manual whenever you're troubleshooting an issue. If you don't find what you're looking for, please let us know and we can add those directions. Please feel free to email me directly. Now we have a few on the call that are new to ICE, so let's start with just a little refresher. Many of you have given your ICE system a new name, but overall the product name is ICE. ICE stands for Interactive Chapter Experience, and it's best used for groups that are chapter-based and have a reporting structure up to the national or international organization. Many of you are using ICE for these main areas listed below, but we want to help you identify other ways that you can use the product. I also want to give a background on how we approach ICE implementations for those that may have not been here during the implementation of ICE. This is a list that contains examples of the main areas that we work together and configure on your ICE system to fit your organization. We have discussions with your staff to learn how your members flow through your organization and identify the requirements for these actions. Several organizations use this opportunity to identify ways that they can simplify their process by using the system to control the chapter's ability to complete certain tasks. While much of this is established during the initial implementation, opportunities for change can occur at any time. ICE gives you the ability to modify much of the setup after implementation. Now, I always like to mention a common method with implementing ICE is that we normally complete all the setup in live because it's not accessible to your users yet. And then we refresh your test environment for actual testing. This is easy during an implementation when the system is not accessible to your users, but remember that you should still, if your ICE system is live, you should still make most of your updates in your live environment so that you will not have to repeat the process or potentially lose your updates if you're only updating test. My rule of thumb is to do all the setup in live unless I need to test transactions that may affect member records like status or member type, or those that might have a financial component because I don't want those invalid transactions in my live IMIS system. You can always test in a live environment by not allowing users to access that area. ICE has security that you can hide certain items that you may have just certain people testing behind the scenes. You can hide the sitemap so those other users in ICE would not even know it's there. So this can be really helpful if you have maybe volunteers outside your building that need to test a process, but maybe your test environment is not accessible outside the building. So this could be a benefit. As a reminder, there's several areas that you can update and change in your configuration. Last month we reviewed workflow setup and profiles, so if you missed that session, you can go to our website to watch that recording. The session in September was on just basic configuration settings, so if you missed that, please watch it as well. But today we're going to talk about form setup, which is probably a big area of a lot of your ICE systems. Firstly, why do we have ICE forms? Forms are a huge part of what makes ICE such a valuable product. Before using ICE, several of you were collecting data via paper forms. In a lot of those organizations, the data from those paper forms never even made it to IMIS. Some of you may have file cabinets in your headquarters that are holding those historical paper forms today. Well, it's sure hard to analyze the data from those forms when they're sitting in a filing cabinet. We really want to get that data into IMIS by using ICE forms. So here are a few examples. There are numerous examples I could put here. It would be a long list, but these are some of the basic general forms that I see several of our groups using. So some of them may be familiar to you, or if you're not collecting some of this data, you may want to think about it. Note that ICE will insert the data onto the chapter's record in IMIS. If you need data on a member's record, consider using a workflow action that we talked about last month. If you have any questions on trying to decide which is the best place, let me know. I'm happy to talk it through with you on just making sure we're using ICE. We wanted to get the data in IMIS, but we want it in the right place. So before building your table or form, you need to have a map. You need to have planning to know what is this going to look like. You need to understand what you're collecting and why, so that when it comes to time to build the form, you're prepared, you will not have to make edits afterwards, you have everything you need, and it'll only take you a few minutes. If I'm going to build a form, I need to know what the form should be called, I need to know how it should look to the person filling out the form, I need to know any instructions that the user will need, I need to know who will be completing the form, typically, the chapter, but maybe it's a collegiate chapter versus alumni chapter. And I also need to know if I need an approval step. So lots of these questions may not necessarily be answered by you, but maybe the department who is ultimately going to be using the data from the form. Again, converting a paper form to an ICE form is a great opportunity to make sure they're collecting data that they're actually using. So you should meet with that department, review that current form, make sure they need to know everything on that form, as well as talk about ways that you can improve the data within the form. A good example is if the form has a lot of text fields, just open-ended comments. You may want to add some additional fields to get some sort of criteria or type or category to give you a little more data points to filter off of in a report, or maybe do some statistics that you can publish reports and show in ICE. Now, there are a few requirements to note before creating an ICE form. All of those questions we reviewed on the last slide will determine the items on the left side of this slide. What will you call the form? What will it look like? Who fills it out, etc. The next requirement is on the right side of the slide. You need to have a spot in IMIS for the data. You need a multi-instance table in IMIS on the chapter records. A multi-instance table in IMIS is a table with multiple rows of data. This is used when you need to keep historical reports. A single instance table cannot be used for an ICE form, but a single instance table could be used in the profile editor section of ICE that we reviewed last month. So if maybe there's some chapter data on a single instance table, again, when you're looking in IMIS at the top right section, Those tabs, those that might look like a spreadsheet, are multi-instance. Those that just have data fields are single instance. You can also only use one IMIS table per form, but you could have multiple forms sending data to the same table in IMIS. A good example is chapter events. I may have one form for social events. I may have one form for philanthropy events, but the data is all going to the same chapter events table in IMIS. That way, I know what event type it is. I can filter that out into reports, or I could pull it all together from one single location. When you have your form mapped out of what you will collect, you will know the fields you need to build in that table. So again, all those questions we reviewed before, those meetings that you might need to have with those departments need to happen before you build that table in IMIS and before you build the form. You need to have that table in IMIS before you even start any processes in ICE. There are also a few fields that you need in the table to collect ICE information, as you see here. The top three, so that's workflow tran key, status, and date, are crucial to have in your table. You should have it in every table that you're using for ICE. All forms have a unique key. Status is collected so that you know if it's been submitted or not. And also date that it was submitted or last edited is also collected automatically. If you have approval requirements, you can also collect information on the status of those approvals with these additional workflow tran approval status, approval by, and approval on. Now here's a screenshot of where in IMIS you would add these fields. So this would be in your setup in IMIS, so your database administrator would do this. In creating your table, you can see it's multi-instances, and obviously there's going to be several other fields in this report or form, excuse me, but you're going to have at least these three fields here. In the user manual, it talks about what is the recommended type and length for each of these fields. So let's review some screenshots on setup when building a form. Here are your form properties. So this is your first step when you hit Create New Form. I have my form code and form title at the top. Title and description will be viewable by the ICE user. Internal note is a great place to store default values for the form. This is so that you can know maybe if you put a default year or term in this form specifically, you can easily identify it by entering that into the internal note. Again, the internal note is only viewable by you as the ICE administrator in the admin portal. Key field prompt, think of this as like a column header for fields that will identify the data in each form. We'll touch on this more in a minute. You'll then select the IMIS table that you just created to store that data from the form. Transaction date is when the form was created, so it will automatically populate. Effective date is when the form should be published. It can be in the past, or you can publish it immediately, or you can put it in the future to be published later. I always recommend to put the effective date in the future if you're creating a new form. That gives you some time to make any last-minute edits to that form because you may be restricted on edits after it's been published already. And especially if it's being published out to your users, you don't want them to start filling out the form if you really intend to make more edits. Through date should be blank or set in the future. When this date passes, the user will no longer be able to see the form in ICE for selection. So I also kind of call this archive date. Now again, it's not archiving the data in IMIS. That data will always live in IMIS. We're going to discuss form types in a minute as well because I want to go into a little deeper on that. And status will show draft until it is published. So whenever that effective date passes, status will be draft until then. Allow edit continuously checkbox. If you're not using a perpetual form, perpetual forms are always editable. You can select to make this form editable by this user. In this example here, I have an on-demand type form, and I'm allowing them to edit it after it's been submitted. Retention period is the archive date for on-demand forms. You don't want to add a through date for on-demand forms because that will remove it from the collection. So retention period is the ability to archive old completed forms. So as you know, on-demand is like a blank form each time. Each time they fill out one, it creates another row for them to select. And if you're using that for an item that they report a lot of events, for example, that list can get quite long. So you might want to archive those reports that they've reported in the past to just not make that list so long for the user. Again, the data is always anonymous, and you can put it in your reports. The next step is the Edit Design tab, and these are fields on the left side are all the available fields in our table. And you can see here I've got those workflow trend fields in my table in IMIS. Of course, I'm not going to put those in the form for the user to see. This is just for the back end. But if I want a field in the report, I would drag it from the left to the right. And notice at the bottom left, there's ability to drag in a content block. So if you maybe need some special instructions, maybe in the middle of the form, especially if it's a long form, you can add a content block in any area of the form to give them a little bit more instructions on how to maybe section it out if your form is quite long. A divider is also very helpful for those long forms. If you have a long form that has maybe category sections, the divider gives it a little break in between those sections so you can easily identify them. If we need to set defaults or anything for the field, so again, these are fields that I pulled into my form, and I clicked Edit onto the field, which is just a little pencil. So I can see, okay, here's my field code. Those are all, things I created in IMIS, and all the link settings and all that is coming from your IMIS database. So if we want to make this an upload attachment, if they need to upload a document, we would check that box for is file upload. Notice the field length requirements. So again, while you're preparing to build that table in IMIS, you need to know which fields are going to have an upload capability so that you can set the character limitations 200 or more. Prompt will be the label that the user sees. Now, prompt will bring in what your prompt was in IMIS as you're building the table. But as you know, IMIS has some character limitations on that field. So here is a good opportunity for you to change that prompt, and you can make it as long as you want. I always like to have my labels in the form of a question if possible, just something easy for your user to understand what this field is for. Putting parentheses to put an example, things like that. For example, if you have checkbox fields, I usually will put, do you have this event, parentheses, check if yes, to make it just easier rather than having maybe a yes/no drop-down. Default values can be added here. Note that if you're using a Gen Lookup validation table, as this field is, it's using academic year, you can see at the bottom, you'll need to enter the code value from the table, not the description value. Now your user will see the description value. So we'll see this in a minute when we preview the form, but I put in 1617 as the code that's in my academic year table. The key field, again, we'll talk about that in a moment. Of course, you can set the field to be required or visible or read-only. Now, visible is a good one to use if there's a field in the report you want it to automatically be inserted when the user submits the data, and you want it to have a certain value. Maybe you already put the default value in there. But it's really just used for you behind the scenes. Maybe it's just something that is easier for you to filter on when you pull the data out into a report. So it's a good way to go ahead and get some pre-filled in data in there that really your user may not need to see. The regex validation, this is a way you can put in some formulas that will judge the field for accuracy on data type, like is it a phone number, is it an email address. We reviewed this a little bit under configuration options when you can do this for date fields or emails and different things like that. There's some example codes in our user manual if you would like to refer to it. If you want to insert instructions within the form, I pointed out before how you can drag in a content block. This is what it's going to look like when you edit that content block. As you can see, it looks like any of your content blocks within ICE. You have the HTML editor, so you can add in images if you wanted to. So you would just pull this in here, insert your text. Usually it's like instructions to maybe separate your long form, and you could insert this into it. I went too far. Okay. You need to set qualifiers for your form. We talked about qualifiers before with membership and leadership actions. This is for who will be filling out this form. Who is this form applicable to? In this case, it's applicable to the chapter, even though the officer or the representative of the chapter is filling out this form. This becomes important if you are utilizing ICE for alumni and collegiate chapters. So you may have a form that's just for your alumni chapters or a form that's just for your collegiate chapters, and ICE will be able to identify which form to show to them. If the form needs to be approved before it is completed, you can add one or more approval requirements. Now, why would we approve forms? I will admit, I'm not a huge fan of having an approval step, only because it does require human intervention to come in to process it through to the approval. I feel that approval should be used when you want to review the action before it occurs. So maybe in situations where they are requesting assistance or a visit or an event request, you could certainly do this process because it does have the ability to notify them if it's been approved or denied. A lot of cases, most of our ICE forms are used for data that has already happened. Reporting after a philanthropy event to say how much money you raised, how many hours, or reporting after you received your scholarship or recruitment statistics. So if somebody needs to review the data, not necessarily approve it, no, you can certainly notify them when the form is submitted so they can go in and review the data. I just wouldn't add that additional step for them to go in to approve it, but you may have situations where this is going to be useful, so certainly use it if needed. And then our almost last step is to preview that form. This is where it's a good place to see, okay, all that stuff I did on edit design, did it select everything that I wanted it to? Is it showing the right value? You can see here for academic year, it just says select a value. And maybe on that last screen I had put in value. If it's not showing the right value that you would expect, in this case it would show that description field, that means the code that you entered as default value is either incorrect or doesn't exist in the table. So again, this is kind of your checkpoint to say, do I have everything set up correctly? Also a good way to check, if I know one field's going to be an upload attachment, does it have that choose file button? If it's not there, then you do not have that field checked. Okay. Of course, I got to give you my Elizabeth's tips. So to talk about naming convention, you saw I had a form code that starts with FRM. I talked about this last time when we talked about workflow actions, where we have lead, or LEAD, for leadership actions, and then we have MEM, MEM, for membership actions. And this is a good way to just sort all those together so that you're consistent naming all the different types of actions. Now, that form code should also not be year or term specific, because that's not the place that we should be identifying that. We can put that in our internal note. We can put that in our default values. The form code should be very general to what the form is collecting, not necessarily specific to the year and term. Always utilize drop-down lists when you can. This just really improves your accuracy on then selecting the right information as well as spelling correctly. Users are going to be filling out forms quickly and not paying attention, so giving them a drop-down list saves them a lot of time and you a lot of unneeded stress, because you can filter off that data that you know is consistent because you're using a gen lookup table. So like I said before, reduce the use of free text fields, mainly because it's just difficult to filter the data out of there. Certainly fine to have a few text fields, especially maybe comment fields for them to elaborate on a topic, but group it with another field that may have a drop-down list or category to give you some more data to filter off on and get some stats. Add your defaults. I really, really want to recommend you add defaults to your forms, especially year and term. This is really helping them identify which form I should pick. They don't read instructions very well. So if we can guide them along the way and maybe make it read-only so they realize that they're submitting it just for this year and term, or even like event type, different fields, any fields that you can add a default to, I highly recommend it. Like I also talked before, if we're creating a new form, put that effective date far out into the future so you have more than enough time to make all your edits, maybe show it to a few people in IceAdmin to make sure it looks good, and then you can go in and change that effective date so that you can publish it immediately. If it's a long form, utilize those separator fields and content blocks within the form to really kind of break it up and keep the user informed on what sections they're filling out. And don't forget key field. So here's where we're going to talk about key field. Key field. I think this is probably maybe the most underutilized area of ICE. It's a little confusing because it's in several different places that you need to check it. But it's very important. Key fields are fields within your form that you identify, and these fields will appear on the step where they pick a form to submit. So this can be very important when you have several forms published, and the user needs to know, okay, which of these 5 do I pick? Key field is going to pull in that data that has been entered as defaults or that has been previously submitted. So if they maybe need to come back to the form to edit it, they can know exactly which one they need to pick. So the first place I need to update for my forms, and you can do this for current forms that you have out there, is go to key field prompt, and this is on the form properties. So if I go, excuse me, go to manage forms and edit the form, on form properties, there's a field called key field prompt. So go ahead and try and identify which of the fields I'm going to be using. So maybe I'm using academic year and term, so it's really pulling 2 fields. So think of this like your column header. I then need to go and pick the field that I want to be used. And you saw that when I edited the field. So I went into academic year and I checked the box for key field. And I also went into term and I checked the box for key field. I could have 2, 3, 4, however many you want. Remember, there's limited space too. And then if I have some defaults, it'll show there. But see, when I go to the form, so the screenshot on the lower right, I can see my key field prompt. So you see my column header is showing there. And then I've put default values in, so I know, okay, the top row is fall 2015, and the bottom row is spring 2015. So if that user needs to know, okay, well, I'm submitting fall or spring, I need to know which one to pick, this is a great guide for them. So go in and update your forms now. Okay, so we talked about all the form setup and properties, but one of those properties is type of form, and this is a good area to talk about what's available in ICE and why you should pick any of these types. So scheduled and perpetual are really almost alike now. Scheduled forms used to not be editable, but we added that enhancement last year where you can select it as an editable form. So perpetual is editable all the time no matter what you pick. But say you had a scheduled form that you wanted them to submit, but you don't want them to be able to edit it later. Scheduled is the way to go. Schedule and perpetual both are great reports for or forms that are due on a deadline. You know, they're due on November 1st to submit your spring grades. They're due on March 1st to submit your fall grades. You know, it's submitted probably 1 or 2 times a year. So that's great that you can go ahead and put in that default year and term. You know what they should be submitting and how many times they should be submitting it. For each of these, though, they do create a blank row in IMIS when it's published. So just know that it will go ahead and create that holding place in IMIS in your table for the data. Now, on-demand forms are great for reports that don't necessarily have a deadline, but maybe can happen at any point in the year and probably multiple times a year, but we don't really know. A good example is maybe your fundraising or philanthropy events or service events where a chapter could have 20 events, another chapter could have 2. But this is a form that's always there for them. It's blank. You can still put in defaults, but I don't recommend them using them as read-only, because remember, read-only means they can't change it. And then, you know, they can make copies and submit as many as they want. You can also make it editable after submittal or not, but it only creates the row in IMIS after it's been submitted, not when the form's published. So as you're looking through these, you know, on-demand, again, is great for those that you don't really know when you're going to receive the data, but I highly recommend schedule or perpetual. Now, schedule and perpetual require a little bit of extra work on your part because we need to go in and publish a new one for each of the periods that they need to submit. So if they are submitting twice a year for fall and spring, I'm publishing a form for fall and I'm publishing a form for spring. But like we talked before, we can put that publish date or effective date in the future. So I can spend a few minutes one day a year to set up all my forms for the upcoming year. Again, you know, you can always edit the form until it's published. So if you have that published date out in the future, you can go in and make changes. So you may want to consider going through your form list that even you have today and considering, you know, do we need to change, you know, maybe some on-demand forms to schedule or perpetual or vice versa. Happy to talk that through as well if you have any questions. Okay. Now, you need to do a little form management. Like we said, we need to make those new published forms. But there's also some other options you can do. Those that have been using ICE, your form management list is quite long. You can You're cloning forms for each new term or year. Don't forget to update the effective date. I don't recommend deleting forms from your list. Why? Okay. When you delete a form, you can never get it back. Deleting maybe a super old form, or maybe a form that you created in error, fine. Certainly able to delete it, but just know that you're never going to be able to reactivate it for the user to pick it again or clone it. It is gone forever. Archiving, like I said, that's really my new name for through dates. So add your through dates to forms that are past the deadline. Maybe I would suggest maybe a month or so past the deadline, just so those late chapters still have an easy way to submit the data even though it's late. And especially forms that are no longer or should be selectable by the user. Maybe they're years old. They shouldn't even show in the list. Retention, set that retention period for those on-demand forms. They will disappear from the list for the user after that retention period has passed. The retention period is from the last time the report was edited. So if you have an on-demand form that is checked to be editable continuously, just note that that retention period doesn't come up until past that last edited date. Republish is a new feature that we just added last summer. This is for new chapters, maybe that have been installed or colonized and added in IMIS after you've already published that form. So again, as we're preparing for the year and publishing all these forms out there, you may need to make a new instance for that new chapter record that has just been added to IMIS, and Republish will let you do that. Okay, and also I want to show you one more screenshot. So this is your Manage Forms page. Don't forget that there's filters up here at the top. You can see here I filtered by form code. And but you can sort by status or type, sorting by through date. So maybe you can get all those with a through date at the end of your list, so they're not, you only see the active ones. And using, description and internal note, you can see these two at the bottom. This is where I've entered what are my default values for these forms. So if I needed to go in and edit the 1516 form, I would know which one to pick, rather than going in and editing, opening up every one. And then once your form is created, you're ready to go, it's been published, your last step is adding it to the sitemap. So in this sitemap, I've added it under chapter options, actions, submit chapter event. You can see on the right side I have my labels, so I need to know what that menu option should say. And then I've selected the form URL from the drop-down, and then I've entered my form code at the end of that URL after the equal sign. Then you select the security role or permission that the user must have in order to be able to submit the form. If they don't have this permission, they will not be able to submit the form. They will get the no access message. Now, just like in other areas of ICE, there are security settings for forms. This security, like I showed you on the last screenshot, is placed on the menu item where the form is to be submitted. Normally, it's like a Submit ICE form. You can certainly make it unique to the form if you wanted to, but remember to make it as simple as possible. Normally, our groups have where there's just a chapter officer submit data. But you could say, you can give certain permissions to certain forms. A good example is maybe the philanthropy chair or service chair can only submit those service reports, but no other forms. Maybe you have some national volunteers that are submitting their visit reports for chapters, but they shouldn't be able to submit the other forms the chapter needs to submit. Same thing for staff members. Maybe you give staff members the ability to submit all data. This, ICE is a much easier place to work in than IMIS, especially when entering form data. So if a staff member, say they're trying to help a chapter fill in a form, they're having issues with their computer, a staff member, just to help them out, can enter that form for them in ICE and they can see it. Okay. Note again, if you are using the file upload feature, you can, it appears as a URL that you can put in your report in ICE. They do need to have the view attachments permission, so if the person that doesn't have the permission to submit the form, but you want them to be able to see the attachment, you need to give them the view attachments permission. Okay. All right, and that is it for forms, but we do have more to learn. We have another session on December 17th, and we just have a couple more topics to cover, so we probably will definitely go into the new year in 2016. Before we go into questions, just a couple more slides. We have our IdeaScale site that all of you should have received information about. This is just another location that you can submit great ideas for ICE enhancements. Again, you're paying an annual support agreement fee that covers these great enhancements. We want the product to get even better and better for you, so your peers can vote and comment. So you can kind of play off each other's ideas on what you want to see in ICE. Don't forget to look at the user manual and let me know if anything's missing. And if you want to present at a fraternal focus topic, please let me know. If you joined us on Tuesday, we had Pete Hanlon from Beta Theta Pi who shared some great information and tips on setting up events in RISE. So if you have any IMIS or ICE or any kind of topics that you'd like to share of great ideas, we would love for you to present in January. All right, 45 minutes in, we're time for questions. I'm going to ask my lovely assistant, Brittany, to help me with those questions. Submit away.
Sure. As of right now, we actually do not have any questions. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to type it in, and we can address that for you. But otherwise, it looks like you've done a great job, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I always like to give them a few more minutes. I'm sure somebody can stop me. But we do have the recordings all on our website under the Fraternal Focus Groups page. So again, if you've missed the last two sessions that we've had as our ICE refresher series, please go in and look at them. And I really recommend that you share them with other staff members that may, not really understand how ICE works, so they can just get a clear understanding. Even though they may not have access to the admin portal, it may just help them understand, what's involved and what they need to be prepared for to talk to you about, adding information to IMIS or to ICE. So, all right, we'll give a few more minutes. Thank you, Jean, for the thank you. I really hope these series are beneficial to you and that you're getting a lot out of it. I think it's great to just kind of refresh our memory on how ICE works and what we can do and change. So let us know if you have any questions after the fact, and we really appreciate you attending today.
And thank you to you, Elizabeth. Great job.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.